I have a news item that Michael just handed me moments ago. Ottawa must deny entry to Islamophobe Robert Spencer. This is from October 24th. Today is what, the 29th? So it didn't work, obviously. I am here, and thank you.
Woo! Thank you.
Thank you for coming out. I was actually detained several years ago for 3 hours in the Toronto airport, and they went through, I wasn't prepared for this, and I had my briefcase. It was, I have to admit, it was kind of a mess. I had all these old receipts and notes from previous talks and such in the briefcase, and they were examining every last one. And I asked them what they were looking for. Hate speech. And they even looked through the Q-tips. They looked through the toothpaste. They were making sure there was no hate speech. So this time, I was ready, and I actually cleared out the briefcase. There was nary a receipt in it, and the Q-tips were fine. There was no hate speech anywhere, except I did bring this along, the Quran. But of course, nobody in Ottawa thinks that the Quran, even though it says kill them wherever you find them, and the unbelievers are the most vile of created beings, and if you have a woman from whom you fear disobedience, then beat her. None of that is hate speech. It only becomes hate speech when I repeat it. And if you think that I'm exaggerating or joking, I'll tell you, there was an imam quite recently in Riverside, California, named Amar Shaheen. And Amar Shaheen recently preached in a sermon, Friday sermon. Friday is the big day for Muslims, and at noon prayer, they have the sermon, the weekly sermon. And Amar Shaheen preached, "O Allah, count the Jews and destroy them one by one and annihilate them down to the very last one." Now you may notice if you keep up with the news that that's exactly the same wording that was used by an imam in Toronto, Ayman I forget his name, something. Anyway, Al-Kasrawi, Ayman Al-Kasrawi. And he prayed exactly the same thing, because this is actually a venerable and established prayer in Islam that goes back to the time of Muhammad. And so Amar Shaheen preached this, and he did not realize that it was being videotaped in exactly the same way as Ayman Al-Kasrawi in Toronto. And the video was published. I took the video and I put it on Jihad Watch, because Jihad Watch is a news site that's dedicated to exposing jihad activity. And I thought, this guy's preaching that Jews be killed. That's jihad. That's news. So I put it up with minimal comment. The only comment I added was a bunch of quote Quran quotations, that the Quran says that the Jews are the worst enemies of the Muslims. It's chapter 5, verse 82, if you want to check in your Quran now. Chapter 5, verse 82 says the Jews are the worst enemies of the Muslims. Chapter 2, verses 62 to 65, chapter 5, 59 to 60, and chapter 7, verse 166 say that Allah transformed the disobedient Jews into apes and pigs. There are many, many other verses that say that the Jews are liars, schemers, enemies of Allah, enemies of the Muslims, enemies of all that is good. So I just listed all those verses, put up the post. Not long after that, I got a notice from Twitter, the online social media platform, because all the Jihad Watch posts go up automatically on Twitter. And so Twitter wrote me and said, "Your tweet has been flagged for hate speech." And what was it? All it said to Twitter was, "California Imam prays for the destruction of the Jews." Now, Twitter didn't have a word to say about Amar Shaheen. They didn't care that he had prayed for the destruction of the Jews. They only cared when I reported on it. Then it became hate speech. It's the same thing with Ayman Al-Kasrawi in Toronto. He prayed exactly the same thing. And not only do Canadian authorities not care, but the Toronto Star, you may have seen if you kept up with the story, ran an extraordinarily lengthy piece saying what a good guy this imam really is. He's a lovable lug. He's a little bit inarticulate. He has trouble expressing himself. You have to be more understanding. And besides, he didn't really mean kill all the Jews. He actually meant kill all the Zionists. But wait, he didn't even mean kill all the Zionists. He just meant, wow, Zionism is bad. How could anybody object to that, considering that Israel is a wicked apartheid state that violates every known canon of human decency? Thus the Toronto Star. Now, there is no doubt that when these people who published this article, they are calling me an Islamophobe, it's because I don't have so positive a view of imams such as Ayman al-Kasrawi. I know that imams have preached, oh Allah, count the Jews down to the last one and annihilate them all over the world. And that in line with that, there are Muslims who have killed Jews all over the world. And I know that Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, said that the end times will not come, the last hour will not come, until Muslims kill Jews. And the Jews hide behind trees, and the trees cry out, oh Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him. Now this is in the Hadiths, the reports of Muhammad's words and deeds. That is what they say that Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, said. And so if you are a pious, believing Muslim and you want to hasten the consummation of all things and the reign of total justice upon the earth, how do you do it? Kill Jews. Muhammad said, the last hour will not come until Muslims kill Jews. So Muslims have to kill Jews first before the last hour will come. Now, did I say that? No. Did I make that up? No, you can find that in the Hadith collection Sahih Muslim at number 4294. Published by Darussalam, the Saudi publishing company. And you can get it on Amazon.com right now, or Amazon.ca right now. Now, if, however, one quotes that, then one becomes an Islamophobe. Now this is what Islamophobia really is all about, and this is why this M103 motion is so vicious and dangerous. Islamophobia is the deliberate and dishonest conflation of two things that actually have nothing to do with one another at all. One is vigilante attacks against innocent Muslims. And you hear about them. You hear about them all the time, as a matter of fact. In the States, of course, the attackers are always wearing Make America Great Again hats. And they always come out and say, I voted for Trump, and you're not welcome here anymore. And then they pull off some poor, innocent, pious Muslima's hijab. No, I'll tell you, that's a terrible thing. Insofar as that ever really happens, that's a terrible thing. But I can tell you that if you go to Jihad Watch and go to the right sidebar and scroll down in the categories, you'll find a category called hate crimes. And there is news story after news story after news story of Muslims saying that vicious Trump supporters pulled off their hijabs, and then police find out it didn't really happen at all. There was one of them made international headlines of a girl named Yasmin Sawaid, who was in New York City. And she was riding the New York City subway. And she said exactly that. A couple of guys in the Make America Great Again hats, and they came up and they started insulting her and abusing her, and they pulled off her hijab. Now, this supposedly happened late in 2016. Now, do any of you have phones? Yeah. Pretty much everyone? The thing about the phones is they have these videos. I'm in New York City fairly often, and I see constantly, because New York City is sort of an interesting place, and so there are always things happening. And I was once on the walking down the street in New York, and this homeless guy started beating this other fellow who was just passing by, and they actually got into a fight, and there was immediately a ring of people around them filming. Yasmin Sawaid said that she was attacked on the New York City subway, and the whole subway car was packed, and nobody came to her aid. Was there any video of the event? Why no? Nary a person took out the phone and started videotaping. You think that's really likely? And then it came out that it was indeed so that she had made up the whole thing because her father found out that she was dating a non-Muslim. And it is forbidden in Islamic law to date for Muslim women to marry non-Muslim men. And she was afraid of her father. And so she was out late one night with this poor fellow, her boyfriend, and so she made up this big story. And it became international news. It was reported all over the world that hateful Trump supporters had attacked this poor girl. Now, this is how vicious this Islamophobia narrative really is. I said it's a conflation of that with what? With honest analysis of the nature and the motivating ideology of the jihad terror threat and of the oppression that comes from Sharia. Islamophobia puts those two things together. It calls vigilante attacks against innocent Muslims, which are never justified, Islamophobia, and it puts that together with honest analysis of what fuels jihad terrorism and Sharia oppression. And it all came together in Yasmin Suwaid. Because what happened was this. This poor girl, she was afraid of her father. And she had good reason to be afraid of her father, because there are numerous accounts, as you may well know, of Muslim fathers who have beaten and even killed their daughters for violating Islamic norms. This is known as honor killing. And one notorious example was in Mississauga, Ontario, 10 years ago. A teenage girl named Aqsa Parvez, a Muslim girl, was strangled to death by her father and brother with the hijab that she would not wear. And so, in the case of Yasmin Suwaid, she appeared in court a few days later because she was charged with making a false police report about this crazy story that she'd made up on the subway. And her head was shaved. She was bald when she went to court with her father, very glum, angry-looking man. Her head was shaved. And the news reports said, very matter-of-factly in the captions, her father shaved her head in punishment when he found out what she had done. Did he shave her? That's all they said. So you got the impression that he was angry about her false police report. I guarantee you he was not angry about the false police report. He was angry that she had been dating a non-Muslim. And to shame and humiliate her and to frighten her into not doing it again, he shaved her head and paraded her before the world and the news cameras with shaved head. Now, that was a signal that this girl was in real danger. That was a very clear indication that Yasmin Suwaid was in danger of being actually murdered by her father. And that could, God forbid, that could still happen. Now, nobody who had reported on her false report, her false claim, said anything about the danger she was in. Nobody even noticed. And this is how the whole Islamophobia charge works. Islamophobia is meant to give the impression that Muslims are being persecuted and discriminated against and harassed and victimized on a broad scale in Canada and in the United States and in Western Europe. This is absolutely false. Hate crime statistics published by the FBI routinely show Jews are twice more commonly the victims of hate crimes than Muslims are, and blacks and many other groups are many times more frequently victimized than Muslims are. But the Islamophobia narrative is that Muslims are the victims, and Muslims are being victimized to such a degree that they need special legal protections. And that this Islamophobia is manifested in the case of girls like Yasmin Suwaid, who were supposedly brutalized in public, out in the open. Then when it turns out that it didn't happen, you don't hear a thing about it, and only people like me report about it. And then we are charged with being Islamophobes, because we are supposedly leading to the brutalization and victimization of the Muslims that is not even happening. Right. And the whole idea, what could be the point of all this? The whole idea is to shut down any criticism of Islam. See, Islamic law. Michael very helpfully brought Islamic law here. This is Reliance of the Traveler. Reliance of the Traveler is a manual of Islamic law published in English It is a very valuable and important book because it is a complete compendium of what Islamic law is really all about. And it's not written by me or by any other non-Muslim. It is a manual of Islamic law that is certified by Al-Azhar, that Christine mentioned, the foremost institution in Sunni Islam, and Sunnis are 85 to 90% of Muslims worldwide. If you go to the beginning here, you have Al-Azhar saying that this book, it corresponds to the Arabic original, and it conforms to the practice and faith of the Orthodox Sunni community. So this is Islam, conforms to the practice and faith of the Orthodox Sunni community. And it says right here that the non-Muslim has to be subjugated under the rule of Islamic law. See, when they say this, it's okay. Nobody has ever complained about the publication of this book. But if I read to you from it, then it becomes Islamophobia. And it says, jihad means to war against non-Muslims. It's right there. Section 09.0. Jihad means to war against non-Muslims. And you war against the non-Muslims, then you subjugate the non-Muslims under the hegemony of Islamic law. They have to obey various humiliating and discriminatory regulations for the privilege of being able to continue to practice their non-Muslim religions under the hegemony of the Muslims. However, this agreement is violated if a non-Muslim mentions something impermissible about Allah, the Prophet, or Islam. So, what happens if you mention something impermissible about Allah, the Prophet, or Islam? Then your life is forfeit, and you are to be killed. Now, it is also in Islamic law that if you blaspheme, if you criticize Islam, if you criticize Allah, Muhammad, or the Quran, then you have to be put to death. Now, the whole project of jihad in the West, do you know why they flew the planes into the towers and the Pentagon on September 11th, 2001? Do you know why the fellow attacked the soldiers and ran them over in Canada and went running into the Parliament building, the other one, and so on? Do you know why all this is happening? The idea is to weaken Western non-Muslim states, to weaken the governments, to make us spend billions and billions of dollars on security, to weaken the economies, so that ultimately the governments fall, and the resulting chaos can be exploited to establish Islamic states. Now, is that likely to happen? We can hope not, but certainly the first part of it's happening great. Think about the trillions of dollars that have been spent by Western governments on security since 9/11, and how our lives have changed. How, if you've been to, I'm sure it's probably the same way in Ottawa, but certainly in Washington, D.C., you used to be able to just walk into a building, but now you have to go through metal detectors anywhere and show ID, and there are those big stone structures outside buildings so that trucks can't just plow into them and so on. And all this, and of course, air security has become so pleasant. Air travel has become so pleasant since 9/11. And it's all because of jihad and weakening our economies. It's working very well. And the idea ultimately is to impose Islamic law over us. Sharia. Sharia forbids criticism of Islam. So, being a little bit impatient and not wanting just to sit back and wait until our governments collapse, which we may hope may never happen, although they certainly need massive changes, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which Christine mentions, 57 Muslim governments around the world, very powerful multinational organization, they have been working on intimidating Western governments and forcing them at the United Nations to adopt hate speech laws, to adopt laws against what they call incitement to religious hatred. And they would say that I am right now inciting religious hatred. What have I done? I read from their book, the law book, I quoted the Quran. It's okay when those things are said by Muslims, but when a non-Muslim says it, it's suddenly incitement to religious hatred. So, the idea is to make any speech that is critical of Islam be criminalized. And that would be, you see, in complete accord with the blasphemy laws that are delineated in Islamic law. That there's no criticism of Islam that is legitimate or valid. all of it is blasphemy, and all of it is to be punished. And they are doing very well at getting the West now to adopt these blasphemy laws that are essentially just Sharia Islamic law regulations about blasphemy, by packaging them as hate speech and portraying Muslims as innocent victims of wholesale discrimination, harassment, and persecution. And so the strategy here is to destroy the freedom of speech and bring Sharia blasphemy laws to the West and establish the precedent then that we have to, whenever Islamic law and Canadian law or American law or British law or French law or German law conflict, then it is the Western laws that have to give way, and that we always have to defer. That is the overall goal and the strategy, and it's working great. Yes. The fact is, though, that the whole multiculturalist enterprise, it really was never intended to be anything like this. And I can tell you, actually, that speaking personally, I would not be here today were it not for multiculturalism, but only in the legitimate sense. I also wouldn't be here today, for that matter, were it not for Islamic Jihad. And I'll explain. My grandparents came to the United States from the Ottoman Empire, the last caliphate, unless you count ISIS, the last Muslim empire in the world. And they came in 1918 because they were invited by Ottoman officials at that time to convert to Islam or to leave the country or face death. And so they were able to get out. My great-grandfather actually was killed as they were getting out, but the rest of them were able to get out. And so I'm able to speak to you today instead of being a, I don't know what, a second-class citizen in the Republic of Turkey. In any case, the situation was this. My grandfather came to the United States, and he was extraordinarily proud to be an American citizen. Now, at the same time, he was Greek, and he never was ashamed or apologetic or anything about being Greek. And when I used to go over to their house, it was like going into another country. I thought it was a very exotic place with the icons and the food, and everything was different. And it was very exciting, really. I thought it was fascinating. And yet he was an American. He was very aware of the value of living in a free society after having grown up as a second-class person, as a Christian, in the Ottoman Empire. And he deeply valued the freedoms and the rights that American society offered to him. And so that's what really, I think, multiculturalism was intended to be. That you have people from vastly different cultural backgrounds and people from vastly different racial and ethnic backgrounds who share values and are able to live together in a society because they share those values. And he never would have thought, well, I'm from the caliphate, we have to bring the caliphate's values here. Of course, he wasn't a Muslim. But if he had known of Muslims who came from his area and wanted to bring the caliphate's values to the United States or to Canada, he would have thought that was abhorrent and that was contrary to the whole idea of immigration and of the generosity and hospitality of the Western states that they were showing to people who were coming here because they were seeking freedom. But now we have a very different situation. You take, for example, in Detroit right now, there are two doctors, Jumana Nagarwala and Fakhruddin Attar, and they are on trial for practicing female genital mutilation. Now, female genital mutilation, people will lie to you all the time and say it has nothing to do with Islam. As a matter of fact, I think it must be in somebody's journalistic style book, the Associated Press or whoever, that whenever you mention female genital mutilation, you have to add a paragraph saying it has nothing to do with Islam. But in fact, it has everything to do with Islam. In Islamic law, Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, who is the excellent example, the highest example for Muslims to emulate, he says circumcision, which is genital mutilation for women, is an honor for men and for women. It's obligatory according to some of the schools of Islamic law. It is desirable according to the other schools of Islamic law. It is often said that it is only practiced in various areas of East Africa. That is not the case. It's practiced in Iran, it's practiced in Iraq, it's practiced in Jordan, it's practiced in Indonesia, it's practiced all over the Islamic world, because if Muhammad said it was good, it's good. So, it's practiced in Detroit, because we got Muslims in Detroit. If you have Muslims in Grande Prairie, there is female genital mutilation here, I guarantee it. Now, these two doctors are the first ones to go on trial anywhere in the Western world for this practice. And you know what they're claiming? They are claiming, and I think this is extraordinary, and this could be the big showdown that we need to have, and we're going to have eventually. They're claiming religious freedom. They're claiming that this is a religious practice. Now, this has really confused the likes of the Toronto Star, because they've been telling us for years that it has nothing to do with Islam. And now here come these two doctors who are practicing it, and they're saying, yeah, it has everything to do with Islam, and that's why we're doing it, and that's why you can't punish us for doing it, because you allow religious freedom. And so now the stories have changed a little bit. Now they say, well, you see, the Dawoodi Bohra sect, which these doctors are part of, comes out of India. They think it's part of Islam, but all the other Muslims don't, which is also false. And the next time another doctor is arrested from some other Muslim sect, then they'll change their story again. But in any case, right now, you have that out in the media. That, well, there's this one sect of Muslims that think that it's something that should be done. I'll tell you something, in Egypt, 90 to 95% of the women have undergone female genital mutilation, and the Dawoodi Bohras have no presence in Egypt at all. They're in India. So, anyway, the thing is, this is the question. Does the freedom of religion, which we value and should value, in Canada and in the United States and in Western Europe, does it allow people to break other laws? If I had a religion that said that I could commit murder of people who don't believe in the religion, and that I could forcibly silence those who criticize the religion, and I could beat disobedient women, and I could mutilate the genitals of women in order to decrease their sexual pleasure so they're more easily controlled, which is what it's really all about. If I had a religion that said all that, of course we couldn't imagine any religion like that really existing, but if I did have a religion like that, does the freedom of religion allow me to break all those laws and just get away with it? If these doctors win their case, then any jihad terrorist who kills people in the United States will be able to get off and cite their precedent and say, well, yeah, sure, I killed these infidels, but it's my freedom of religion. See, the freedom of religion was never intended by any government that grants it or allows for it to be some sort of a license to kill or a license to break other laws. The freedom of religion was obviously designed to protect and defend the society by trying to keep the religious wars that were such a terrible feature of life in Europe for so many centuries from coming to the New World. Great. But nobody ever intended in the United States or Canada or anywhere else that the freedom of religion would mean, oh, you can do whatever you want if your religion says so. And this is the problem, that this is the conversation that we have to have as nations in Canada and in the United States, in Britain, in France, in Germany, and the rest. We have to decide, are we going to continue to appease and accommodate these religious practices that are clearly at variance with our laws and our customs and our mores? Or are we at a certain point going to stand up and say, no, that much and no more? And if you're going to come here, then you have to be a Canadian. You have to be an American. You have to be a Frenchman. You ever see that? Do you ever notice? Of course, I watch these things every day, and so I see all the time that when there's a jihad attack and the guys are French citizens, for example, they'll say 3 Frenchmen blew themselves up in Iraq after joining ISIS. And I think 3 Frenchmen, really? Were they wearing berets and carrying baguettes? They weren't French. They were Muslims who believe that they are the best of people, the best nation on earth. That's in the Quran, chapter 3, verse 110. And that the unbelievers are the most vile of created beings. That's chapter 98, verse 6. And so if they were born in France, they had nothing but contempt for France and for French law. They were never Frenchmen. And we have to decide that. Are these people who do not believe in Canadian law and who believe that Canadian law is actually vile and is a product of Jahiliyyah, the society of ignorance, and is worthless trash? Now, as must be emphasized, of course, not all Muslims think this, yes, but we're kidding ourselves if we don't think that there are Muslims who think this. This is in the Quran. And if you really think that the vast majority of Muslims don't believe in the Quran, well, you're in for a rude surprise. And so are we going to say, yes, these people who completely deny the values and the principles upon which our societies are based are going to come here and live and everything is going to be okay? The fact is that the Quran mandates warfare against unbelievers, and it mandates that the inferior society and laws of the infidels be replaced by the society and law of the best nation on earth. Because that passage, you see, chapter 3, verse 110, that says you are the best nation on earth, it goes on, enjoining what is right and forbidding what is wrong. That's what makes Muslims the best nation on earth. That they know what's right and wrong and we don't. Because we are, according to the Quran, chapter 8, verse 55, like animals. Animals, they're just going to do what they do. They don't really know about right and wrong. But the best people on earth know what is right and what is wrong. Now that means that some Muslims, yes, not all, but some Muslims are going to come to Canada and think it is my responsibility before Allah to bring a knowledge of right and wrong to these people who are like animals, these most vile of created beings. These emigres are coming because they believe that they will be rewarded by Allah for doing so. Chapter 4, verse 100 of the Quran, you can follow along in your copy, it says, "He who emigrates in the way of Allah will find in the earth enough room for refuge and plentiful resources." Thank you, those are the notes I didn't follow anyway. "He who emigrates in the way of Allah will find in the earth enough room for refuge and plentiful resources. And he who goes forth from his house as a migrant in the way of Allah and his messenger, and whom death overtakes, his reward becomes incumbent upon Allah." Now this is very important because if you read the whole Quran, you'll see that it's full of descriptions of hellfire, really lurid, detailed descriptions of how Allah will pour molten lead down the throats of the people in hell, and he will burn off their skins and then issue them new skins so he can burn them off, and just all these horrible tortures. And so if you believe that this is the perfect word of Allah and the perfect guide for all humanity, you're going to be very scared of going to hell. And there is this passage that I just read you saying, if you leave your home and come to a new place, but in the way of Allah, which means you're bringing Islam to the new home, you're not just coming to get a job, then you will get a reward from Allah. Then there are going to be at least some of the migrants who believe that and think that the more that they can Islamize Canada, the more they will get a reward from Allah. And that Islamizing Canada means bringing the sense of right and wrong from the Quran and the Sunnah, Islamic law, into Canada. Because those most vile of created beings, they don't know what's right and what's wrong. So, the whole fight about the motion M103 and the impending criminalization of hate speech is really part of a larger attempt to do nothing less than to destroy free society in Canada And of course it's happening in the US and other ways as well, and all over Western Europe. And to make it impossible for us to speak out against what's happening, because of course if we do, then we are shamed and defamed and demonized by the people who are using this term Islamophobia to stigmatize any criticism of Islam. And so it is of utmost importance that all of you who are here understand the gravity of the situation and understand how important it is to fight against any further encroachment upon the freedom of speech and free society here. And ultimately, I do think it's unfortunately going to get worse before it gets better, but at the same time, this is, in the larger sense, this is a war of lies versus truth and reality versus fiction. You know, I was banned from Britain for saying Islam is not a religion of peace. That doesn't make Islam a religion of peace. No matter how many times they keep repeating that Islam is a religion of peace, the Quran still says, kill them wherever you find them 3 times. Yeah. And when you meet the unbelievers, strike the necks, behead them twice. And on and on and on, warfare against unbelievers. And so we have the truth on our side and reality on our side. And so ultimately, because of that, although the coming years may be very difficult, because the truth and reality can never lose, we can never lose. Thank you very much.